Well, good morning, friends. I say that knowing that some of you might be in other places that's in later part of the day, but we'll say good day to you. But here in Seattle, it's morning, and very grateful for this day and the opportunity to introduce the Stanley Grenz Lecture Series to you. This is our 8th annual meeting, and this meeting it's usually a series of 3 events, and this year we'll just do 1 because of COVID. But it's exciting, an exciting moment for us in our year to think about the theological issues that in some ways are impacting our culture. This year, it is both a sober backdrop, but I believe a hopeful moment. And this morning I woke up and the word cascade was in my mind, this notion that we are falling and tumbling and not always sure what would make for peace in these days. The presentation this year is called Dare We Hope for a Tomorrow. Dare We Hope for a Tomorrow. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you a friend and a colleague and a community member. We are church brothers and brothers even beyond that. Dr. Brian Bantum. Dr. Brian is the Neil and Isla Fisher Chair of Theology at Garrett Theological Seminary. He is also the author of Redeeming Mulatto, a theology of race and Christian hybridity, and The Death of Race, building a new Christianity in a racial world. Dr. Bantum has spoken in many places across the country on issues of Christian life and identity and the realities of race and gender. And so it is my pleasure to welcome to the Grenz Lecture Series this year. Brian also has invited some guests that I'll let him introduce to you later on, but it's a pleasure to invite Brian to speak to us and share with us the possibility of a hope for tomorrow. And so thank you, Brian, for being with us, and welcome.
Thank you so much, President McNeil. I got the invitation to be a participant. Obviously, I was honored having been in Seattle, having seen the number of Grenz lecturers who have come. I was honored to receive the invitation and to participate. And then Derek told me the day. And I was like, do I really want to do something on that day? And so as we were talking, we were trying to think about what would today look like, and what would it mean to kind of gather in a moment when we know really no one is thinking about today and everyone's thinking about tomorrow. When we've been on this road before about hoping for tomorrow only to find a kind of disappointment. And so that's where we've kind of thought about this idea of a theme of dare we hope for tomorrow. And of course, not thinking about a hope as a kind of naive idea that things will simply be better, but a hope that believes in something that is with us, that believes that there is something that is possible for us, that there is a kind of flourishing, a kind of freedom that God intends and hopes for us, that we might also participate in. But what does that look like? Does that look like simply me, reading parts of my book, offering a little bit of scholarship? When I started to think about this idea of hope, I couldn't help but be reminded of the people who created hope in my own life, people who created space for me in some ways. And so we'll have a number of guests with us today, in some ways because it is reflective of what maybe tomorrow might be. And so I wanted to start my remarks by talking a little bit about ways that hope was created for me, that in some ways I might dare to hope for tomorrow because I am a child of hope. My mother grew up in an violently abusive household, feared for her life numerous times as a survivor of abuse and assault. And when she had me, she met a man who loved her in lots of ways, but as these things tend to happen, was also himself an alcoholic. And but one of the things that she was determined to do was to not have her children live in the same kind of fear that she lived within. Um, and so while struggling with mental health issues, while struggling with depression, with bipolar, she nonetheless held our house together in a way where there was not a moment in my life where I did not feel both safe and loved. And I really too believe that it took every ounce of strength in her body to make that possible. So much so that it even required a kind of courage, a kind of willingness to risk something. Because my father, while not a violent alcoholic, was an irresponsible one, an unfaithful one. And there was one moment when I was playing with toys in my brother and I had a bunk bed, and I had all of these Matchbox cars. I had about 50 Matchbox cars underneath my pillow because I hated to go to sleep. And I don't know what I was going to do with 50 Matchbox cars at 2 o'clock in the morning, but there I had them. And I think I messed up. I pushed something, and they all fell out, hit the floor. My dad had come home, had had too much to drink, and it was one of the few moments when he was really, really angry and started to undo his belt to let me know that I needed to go to sleep. And at that moment, my mother threw herself between the two of us and told him he had to leave. And they got divorced sometime later. And it was that moment when I started to realize that there was a space that my mother wanted to create for us, a space that my mother wanted us to feel a kind of freedom, to feel that we could grow into something and enjoy a kind of possibility for tomorrow that she herself could not create. And so her tomorrow, in a sense, was in my tomorrow. Her hope for tomorrow was in my kind of dreams and my possibilities. Now, the part of this, though, is that in the midst of her mental health issues, in the midst of her severe back pain, she was on disability for most of her life. I still to this day believe that all of the trauma that she endured and throughout her life was almost held in her body. That she held it so that it might not reach me. And yet at the same time, this idea for hope is not all roses and free bike rides. Because in the ways that I always saw the ways in which that trauma marked her life, I was concerned for her in the same ways that she was concerned for me. But as we began to kind of grow, as I began to develop an understanding of who I was, I came into a kind of racial understanding of who I was. My white mother also could not quite understand who this Black child was becoming in her life. I still remember this time I'd come back from an African-American history class. I'd kind of begun living into the fullness of what it means to be a Black man, was watching TV about yet another white serial killer. And I was just like, oh, white people. And I looked over and I saw my mother with tears in her eyes because she said, not all white, those aren't all white people. Are you saying that I'm like that? And so then we began to kind of have these conversations about race, about whiteness, about white supremacy. And it was clear that my mother had no idea what it was that I was discovering, what it was that I was living. And so I say this because in some ways, when we talk about hope for tomorrow, our hope is not necessarily in talking about and idealizing a kind of myth of who my mother was, a myth of what my life growing up was, that there were some real profound limitations in how she saw the world and how she saw me, and yet nonetheless continues to love me, continues to wrestle. Unfortunately, she would eventually pass away when I was 25 from lung cancer. And so I'm not sure that she ever came to a full realization of what it meant to be the mother of a Black child. We had conversations, we had tensions, we had difficult ways of trying to think about together what our life was. But she was always there for her grandchildren, always there for me, always visiting with food in hand, with armloads full of toilet paper, feeding my hungry child rice cereal, slipping a little rice cereal into his formula bottle when I wasn't looking, because she knew that's what he needed. And so my mother, it's this idea of creating space, of beginning to imagine and caring for a kind of community, is one that is always fraught with risk. This brings me to a second community that created space for me. As I began to live into what it meant, the fullness of what it meant to be a Black man in the world, beginning to understand both the dangers and the implications of that, but also the possibilities, I was introduced during my doctoral work to an organization called the Fund for Theological Education, trying to find a certain sense of space, working in a predominantly white institution, not having a lot of conversation partners, not really knowing what it meant to do this work as a person in a deeply racialized, racist system. And the fund for, at the time, the Fund for Theological Education was just that, funds, money. And I needed some money. I was a poor grad student, and I was like, bring it on. And what came along with the money was a chance for mentoring. So it's like, okay, I'll go get some mentoring as long as I get the check. Give me the check, I'll go get some mentoring. So I go to the mentoring. I do a little conference, and all of a sudden I am introduced to a room full of Black intellectuals. People whose books I had read in school, but it also folks who were also doctoral students in the position that I was in, oftentimes in predominantly white institutions, where they were struggling to have their questions heard, where they were writing for their lives or writing for the life of their community, and weren't sure what it looked like to do that work. And all of a sudden I had people who saw me and saw my questions as something that was important for the world. So that was my lifeline going through doctoral work. And then fast forward a little bit, I'm out get my first job in the Pacific Northwest, another predominantly white institution, not quite sure what I'm going to do, feeling even more isolated than I had before. And then I get invited back to serve on what would become the Forum for Theological Education Explorations transformation, as they were beginning to rethink their own vocations beyond simply giving money. And what I was introduced to there was I was invited back not as a student with no questions, but as someone who presumably had some sort of answer. And I would look around, I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. What are we talking about? Well, what I came to understand was I was just being a few steps ahead means that I was farther ahead than someone else, which meant that I had learned something because I had gotten those few steps, which meant that I could pass on that knowledge. And through that process of working, helping doctoral students in the Forum for Theological Exploration, I also began to become connected to another group of scholars who themselves were asking questions of what does it mean to create space in their classrooms? What does it mean to create space in their communities? What does it mean to hold together family and friendships and the wholeness of who they are, but still do the work of scholarship, still teach in ways that are rigorous and true? And so what I found in the midst of this, through this group, was the possibility of that it was not simply the number of books that I wrote that was going to be the measure of who I was as a scholar or a mentor. It was not simply the kinds of articles or reproducing my own mentor's trajectory, but it meant inhabiting who I was in a new way. And so what this meant was that my classrooms are going to be spaces where I created space much in the same way that my mother created space, recognizing that we all come from spaces of trauma. We all come from spaces of death. We come from spaces where the fullness of our personhood is not recognized. And yet, that is possible even with a small modicum, a 35-year-old who had only been teaching for 2 years, doesn't know nothing about nothing. And yet it's still possible for that person to create a small modicum of space for someone else to be able to breathe a little deeper, discover a kind of possibility for themselves that they might not have had without that space. And so as I begin to think about this question of dare we hope for tomorrow, I could not help but think about that there is not a singular idea of what we can do to make tomorrow easier, to even think about what happens beyond tomorrow. That there's not some brilliant essay, brilliant theory, theology that I could unearth for you in this moment that could somehow allow you to get through the next day. The only thing that I really have to share is, in fact, the community that made it possible for me to breathe a little bit. To share with you a conversation of people for whom I have the deepest respect, people who have helped me to learn that it's not how big my brain is or how big my book is that makes me brilliant, but my brilliance actually comes in the ways that I can see the people in front of me, the ways that I can allow them to become known, and that my success comes in their success. And we don't meet that often. We only meet once, twice, maybe 3 times a year. But there's always something about those meetings that I come back away from rejuvenated, ready to do the work again, but also challenged to do it in ways that require me to grow. And I come back to my mother because I think part of what I think about this idea of hoping for tomorrow is to say that we also know that we don't get it right, that we are always trying to grow. And that part of the reason why I love these people that we are going to hear from next is because they always are reminding me of what it is that I have to continue to learn. But they never ask me to do it in ways that are like them, right? But they do it in ways that allow me to discover the truest sense of myself. And so as we begin to think about and continue this afternoon and morning, I hope we can begin to think a little bit about the kind of commitments that we make, whether it is the commitment to simply not allow all the crap that has formed us to flow through us to another person, whether it is the commitment to learn and to stretch and to grow and not allow the alienation that we feel through those discoveries to prevent relationship. Or perhaps we can be committed to use the small modicum of power that we have to create a community that makes life possible. So I don't know what other commitments will come as we hear from us today, but our hope is that through this conversation that those of you who are listening or watching will come away not with simply a better idea, but perhaps with a sense of what it is that I will do tomorrow, what I will do the next day to help create a sense of life in the days to come. And so with that, I want to introduce our panelists, and then after each one shares their own thoughts, the 5 of us, along with President McNeil, will have a little bit of a conversation, and then we'll close. So it's my great honor to introduce these wonderful, esteemed friends, panelists, colleagues to you today. Our first presenter is Dr. Christine Hong. She is the Assistant Professor of Educational Ministry at Columbia Theological Seminary. Her research and teaching interests center on Asian American studies, child and adolescent behavior, development and immigrant communities, church history, post-colonial studies, and systematic theologies. Her publications include Identity, Youth, and Gender in the Korean American Christian Church. And I'm always struck by Dr. Hong's ability to help students to feel seen in the midst of their story, in the midst of really complicated ideas. And I was struck as one of the things that she's written that's kind of always stayed with me is from Inheritance magazine, where she's talking about the interrelationships between women in the Korean American church. And she writes, "Today, my mother still teaches me that community is not symbolic. It is real and lived day to day, constantly negotiated and co-created." And as I've watched Dr. Hong cultivate spaces for doctoral students in her own classrooms, I see the brilliance with which she does this each day. Our next panelist will be Dr. Patrick Reyes. He is the Senior Director of Learning Design at the Forum for Theological Exploration. He's the author of Nobody Cries When We Die, God, Community, and Surviving to Adulthood, which was also selected as the inaugural book of the Children's Defense Fund Annual Book Club. It is an amazing book, an amazing story. And one of the things that I love about Dr. Reyes is, again, the ways in which he curates these spaces of critical flourishing. It's one of those things where you could be a kind of rah, you can do it, but when everyone knows that it's all crap around you, like that's not sufficient to say you can do it. So what he does is says, you can do it, look at these tools, look at those tools, look at one another, and reminds us that it's not simply that we can do it, but it's also a question of how we do it. And he continues to challenge me in those ways every day. And then lastly, Dr. Pamela Lightsey is the Vice President of Academic and Student Affairs, Associate Professor of Constructive Theology at Medville Lombard Theological School. Her publications include Our Lives Matter, A Womanist Queer Theology, as well as articles such as He is Black and We Are Queer and Albert Cleage Jr. in The Black Madonna and Child, and Reconciliation in Prophetic Evangelicals, Envisioning a Just and Peaceable Kingdom. Dr. Lightsey is a prophetic practitioner and mentor, administrator, teacher, social justice advocate for racial justice and LGBTQ rights. I don't really know what it is that she has not done. But what I do know is that she is a person who has a fervent love for our people and will never hesitate to speak and organize for the sake of their lives. It's one of those things where you have a person who kind of always speaks up, but something about those kind of powers and principalities, if they know that all you are is talk, then they just let you just talk, and then they just wait for you to stop and then just keep doing what they're gonna do. What Dr. Lightsey, though, does, you got to be scared if she talks, because if she talks, it means she's also going to organize, which means it's also going to be a kind of a powerful demonstration and display of what it means for us to imagine a different world. It means that your world is going to change because she's in it. And I continue to am enriched and learn from her every day. So this is our panel, our conversation, our family in lots of ways. And I am eager to learn along with you all from them today. So Dr. Hong, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dr. Bantum, I changed my entire what I was going to say after hearing your story, which I think happens a lot in our circles, that we inspire each other as we go. As you were talking about your mom and talking about hope, I was also trying to reflect on how I began to understand hope, both as a child and as an adult, and how hope has arrived in my life in different ways and what hope looks like. So I also think about my parents. I'm a child of Korean immigrants and grew up even as a child before people could fully understand what I was saying, culture brokering for my parents who had limited English. And also just kind of, I grew up bicultural while they were still sort of catching up. And that's really what happens in a lot of new immigrant families, is children end up, becoming more bicultural way before their parents do. So I grew up feeling really resentful about that. I felt like childhood looked really differently in my family than it did in some of the families of my peer groups. And one of the ways in which they taught me was my mother specifically. I remember this. When she would teach me, she would say, all of these things that I'm teaching you about Korean community and language and culture connect you with people that are beyond just us. She reminded me about both sets of my grandparents as they fled the northern parts of the Korean Peninsula during the war, as they lived and were born into Japanese occupation, all of those struggles. And she wanted to teach me the things that would connect me to those struggles, even to those traumas. One of the ways that I feel like I learned it most deeply in my body is through this thing that's very Korean. And the Korean phrase for it is called 손맛. 손맛. 손맛 literally means the flavor of your hand. The flavor of your hand. And you use it when you're referring to cooking, to cuisine. So my mom, one of the things that she taught me so much, but one of the things that she didn't want to teach me was how to cook Korean food. And the reason was because she was always about like subverting the patriarchy. And she said, I just don't want you to, you know, partner up into a house where you're expected to do this stuff like I was expected to do. So I'm not going to teach you how to do it. So you can just go and say, I never learned. But when I left my home, when I was 18 and went to seminary, one of the things I really missed was my mother's cooking. She had never taught me how to cook. I missed the flavors, that flavor profile that came from very specifically, you know, it was a regional, particular cooking that she learned from my grandmother that came from a particular part of North Korea that we could now never go to. And this is before people were doing things on YouTube and you could find this stuff. So I just started cooking in the basement of my seminary housing and just started to experiment with the flavors to try to find and locate those flavors that I remembered, but had never actually been taught to recreate. So my mother actually came back to live with us in Atlanta just for a couple of years. And I cooked a lot for her. And she said, she kind of mourned this, you know, she's like, oh, I didn't really want you to grow up cooking, but you cook so much. And I said, I really enjoy it. And how come you never taught me, you know, how to cook these things? And I feel like your food tastes different from mine. And she would start to sample. You know, it's really bad when your mother is sampling your food. It could be really, really great, or it could be really bad. A lot of judgment. But she did something where she turned and looked at me when I made this one particular dish. It's Korean dish that's a little bit hard to make. It's called 감자탕. It's pork neck and potatoes, and it's spicy, and it's got perilla leaves. It's really good. And she looked at me and she said, how did you know how to make this taste like this? And I said, what do you mean? And she goes, how did you get the 손맛? And I said, I remembered the flavor that came from your hand. I remembered the flavor that came from your hand. And I just tried my best to recreate it. And she said, that's the flavor of your grandmother's 감자탕 and her grandmother's 감자탕. That's the flavor of our family. That's the 손맛 of our family. So when I think about growing up in this family and all the things that they deliberately taught me and the things that they withheld from me, I think for me, hope looks like that. Hope looks like people helping you cross over some of these borders and boundaries that exist. For me, that was the borders and boundaries of culture, of language, of things like the flavor of food, but it's also hope that's carried in your body, right? Through being able to recognize the flavors of your people. Saying, you know, even if I never met my great grandparents, that their legacy still lives on with me. It's literally in my taste buds. It's in my fingertips. I know how to recreate those memories for myself and now for my own children who are going to be able to remember those things as well. Hope is more than just something that comes to us passively. We work at it, right? It's a discipline. Just like I spent all those hours in the basement of seminary housing trying to recreate this 감자탕 flavor, that it's practiced. One of the things I learned from my parents watching them struggle as new immigrants was that hope is a discipline. It's a practice that they invested in every day, that they taught me to practice every day. And today, I think when I think about hope as we kind of on the precipice of perhaps something very unknown that might happen tomorrow and beyond tomorrow, is that remember the people and the lives that poured into you, the hope that you can taste with your whole body. Not just hope that looks, that sounds a particular way, that seems to have all the right words, but hope that sometimes you can't even wrap words around, because it's so internalized in you and it lives in you so deeply and emerges at those critical moments of crisis that is in every cell of you. So remembering the names, the flavors, the sonmat of your people that poured their lives into you, their hope into you. And then also as we venture into this tomorrow, to pour back into the lives of people coming behind you. I think that's one of the things that I've learned from my parents too, is that they remind me, it's your responsibility now to pass on the sonmat. It's your responsibility now to not let that die or fade away and just to go into the ether, but to pass it on. And even if your children don't have language, they should have the sonmat. They should know the flavor, right, of what it means to be Korean, what it means to have survived all of those things in our family. That even if they couldn't carry anything else out, that my grandparents, my grandmothers carried out that flavor in their body of what it meant to thrive, that what it meant to celebrate who they were. So for me, I think today, hope is a discipline that requires that attention and that practice to the daily, the daily understanding that it's not about escaping uncertainty or leaving behind crisis for good, but finding a way to see beyond this particular moment through the things that we've inherited, from our people. And part of that is knowing who your people are, being rooted in that peoplehood. Right? Being rooted in those people, those lives, those names, those flavors as well. One of the other things that I want to say is that it can be that in these moments that hope is too hard for some of us, that hope is a discipline that we haven't cultivated. And so we cannot hope. And I know that I've arrived at those places and moments as well. And one of the things that I'm reminded of when I cannot hope is that hope is not just my own responsibility, but hope is communal, that people carry you, right, when you cannot carry yourself. And that sometimes we're called to carry others and sometimes we're called to receive the help when hope becomes too hard. So just want to say, hope is storied, it's historical, and it's sonmat, the flavor of your hand.
Thank you, Dr. Hong. Thank you, Brian, for the invitation, and sitting here with Pamela. It's like I got invited with all my teachers. So this is good to be here. Look at Pamela rolling her eyes. It's good to be here. I want to start at the beginning since Brian talked a little about FTE. So I'm at the Forum for Theological Exploration. I have the privilege and honor of being the first Latino director of the doctoral initiatives and shepherding a history that goes back to 1968. So as we talk about hope, these programs that support scholars of color go back to the same year that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the same year that John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their black glove fists in the air at the Olympics in Mexico, in the same place where college students were murdered for declaring human rights violations in that same place where we tried to celebrate World Games. 1968 was also the year Cesar Chavez had his first hunger strike and broke his fast with communion. 1968 was also the year that Kennedy was assassinated, fall into the arms of a young busboy who put a rosary in his hand as life left his body. So as we think about these moments that we're in, I think about the elders, the ancestors, the history that I have the privilege of working in an institution to shepherd to this moment and for this moment. Well, that's a heavy burden. It's not light. It also means that I'm not standing on shaky ground. It's a lot of good people, including everyone on this call, who've gotten us here. So I'm grateful for that. As I think about hope for tomorrow, I think it's also important for me to introduce myself in my words and my family. While I am Patrick Reyes, I am also sitting between 5 generations of Carmelitas. Going back 5 generations behind me, there's a Carmelita that I can find on documentation. And that's also my daughter's namesake. My daughter is a Carmelita. And I imagine in 5 generations beyond her, there'll be another Carmelita. And so I'm sitting in this moment as we think about tomorrow, because it seems imminent for us in the United States right now, that I am the product of generations of survival. And I'm also shepherding that sacred wisdom so that in 5 generations beyond, that the Carmelitas on each side of me are both proud and love what we've done in this moment. And so I try to capture both my professional life and my personal life in these deeper historic terms. So that way I know that my work is not alone. I'm not alone. I have all of you, but I also have this deeper history, deeper traditions, ancestral wisdom, as Dr. Hong mentioned. But I also need practices to remind me of these things. It's not enough to just kind of know them in my head. As Dr. Hong mentioned, we got to know them in our hands. And so I'm actually going to invite everyone who's watching to do a little practice to think about, how do you remind yourself of what hope looks like or what it feels like to carry this forward in this moment? So here's my invitation. Get out your phone, look at your phone, the photos on your phone. Or if you have albums, go get your old albums and find a picture of you as a baby. Find a picture of you when you could not talk. Find a picture of a baby. I'm being serious here. Find a picture. I'm going to say some more filler words while you find a picture of a baby. Let's see if we can do this without my little circle light getting in the way. That's Grandma Carmen and Grandpa Julio holding little baby Pat. Now, when I think about hope, you can't tell me when I look at a picture of my baby, of myself as a baby, that my grandparents didn't look at me with the loving eyes that I was capable of doing anything in the world. That sense of hope is existing in that look that they give me, and that I have not been charged to give that same look to my kids. That's what I'm passing on. Tomorrow and hope, what's going to happen tomorrow will happen tomorrow. But this right here, to know that I'm the product and the result of generations of survival and love, and that I too have the responsibility and the great privilege of sharing that same gaze from my grandparents to me with future generations. What a gift. What a gift. This world is full of violence for communities of color, for Black, Indigenous, broader peoples of color. We have been in this for a minute. I wrote a piece for Faith and Leadership talking about voting rights in this country. It's been a journey, and we're going to show up at the polls tomorrow. And we got 5 generational work to do. It's not just tomorrow. That's not hope. Hope is that gaze. We cross generations, that love that needs to be carried forward. Man, what a responsibility. That's not a campaign. That's not a policy. That's not a book. That's generational work. That takes practice, as Dr. Hong says. And one of the things I love about looking at these pictures of me as a baby is when I'm sure y'all find them in your books. If you don't have them, ask for whoever has them. Is that somewhere you'll see someone giving you that look. And that's what we need to be reminded of, that we are both beloved and we can look longingly, lovingly at those who we love as well. And we need to pass that work on. So Brian, I appreciate the question about hope, because as you all know on this call, hope for me is about tomorrow, but it's not just about tomorrow. And it is about writing the books, but it isn't just about writing the books. It's about carrying around and carrying forward that look of love for future generations. So that way the Carmelita 5 generations behind me and the Carmelita that's 5 generations yet to come knows that look, that gaze of love has been passed on faithfully and fully.
I want to say thank you to all my colleagues who've gone before and for the invitation to be here. I think I saw in a chat from a former student, Jared Hamilton, being in the room. So I want to do a shout out to Jared. And Gail, Brian's wife, I saw her in the chat room. So, you know, I want to be beautifully Black and acknowledge the people that I know who are in my Amen corner. And just say thank you all. Thank you all who come. This matter about hope. You know, Patrick, I don't have any baby pictures of myself. I don't know why, you know, whether it was because my parents were so poor. My mother was a maid. She worked for very rich white people in Palm Beach County, and my father was a day laborer. You understand, Patrick, your parents, this is the journey of your life also. So my father would jump on a truck to do work and get paid under the table every day. And so we were very poor, you know, 7 children in a 2-bedroom apartment. I just don't, I don't know why there are no pictures of me. There are no pictures of any of my siblings, but the pictures that do emerge of me when I was growing up are pictures of a very angry teenager. Wonderful, bold afro, you know, like, I'm so serious, you know, you don't even want to try to challenge me, you know, fist in air. And these were not just pictures, these were my reality, you know. I lived a kind of life that was filled with anger and always postured myself for a fight. Because that was part of my survival in those days. I grew up near the end of Jim Crow South in Palm Beach County, West Palm Beach, not to be confused with Palm Beach, because Palm Beach is, you go over the bridge and that's where you have all the rich white folks. And, you know, Black people and Latinos, they go over and they work that area, you know, to make it beautiful. And this is where you get all the Hollywood movies and, you know, the films from the labor of the people who live across the bridge. So that's how I grew up. This matter of, I also want to say that this thing, dare we hope for tomorrow, I find to be just so apropos for where I am today. I feel like, I was telling a friend that I feel like I'm about to get a whipping. You know, I grew up at a time where your parents would whip you. I hate to say that. The whippings I got, they were criminal, just criminal, really. And I had that gut feeling, you know, and not that I'm not being prophetic here, but I feel I'm on that kind of edge, that kind of whipping edge. That's the way I feel. And that way of being, you know, growing up with that way of being, you having to duck and dodge and miss a lick here and miss a lick there, was not a way that really endeared you to a sensitivity about hope. Okay. And so hope has not been a thing that has been my go-to in life. In fact, I prefer to call myself someone who believes in a kind of agnostic hope. And I've had this conversation with friends throughout the years, most recently. In Mark, because, you know, I came up Baptist and then Pentecostal. So from a theological perspective, if one were to go to the biblical text and look in Mark, you see Jesus having this conversation with this man who, and I love this text because, and I use this text often because it describes me when it comes to hope. This man has his son, he brings his son to Jesus and he wants Jesus to heal his son. His son cannot speak and his son is given to fits of seizures, and he brings his son to Jesus, and Jesus basically says to the man, now, if you believe, I can heal him. And the man throws himself at Jesus's feet and says to Jesus, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. That's where I am when it comes to hope. I kind of believe, but I got a whole lot of doubt in me, because the world that we live in has a way of just beating the hell out of your hope. And, you know, my parents and my upbringing, at the same time that I'm agnostic about hope, the teeny bit, if I can use that kind of verbiage, of hope that I have is always rooted in community. As a scholar, it's always rooted in community. I grew up at a time and an era when we were among the first to be bused from our community to desegregate a school system. And I remember there were riots. I mean, we're now on that same precipice, aren't we? People are boarding up. People are basically saying we're on the cusp of another civil war in our country. Well, you know, the first day of school for me, I was a nervous wreck, you know, because I had to get on a bus and be bussed out of my neighborhood. And so I asked my mother, you know, riots were going on in the city. They had found a bomb underneath one of the buses. And I was just afraid, and I asked my mom, I said, now what if a riot breaks out? What should I do? And my mother, no nonsense, she's no nonsense woman, said, you stick with your people. You find your people, you stick with your people, and you're gonna be all right. All right. So that has never left me. You know, I'm a woman of a certain age, as you can see. But that teaching has never left me, that somehow, if I am within community, that my hope and that my safety is within community. Now, what that community looks like has changed throughout the years. I'm in the academy now. I'm a womanist in the academy. And I have learned that my community in the academy is shaped by scholars who really understand their work as a work of giving back to communities of persons who are oppressed, to Black, to Brown, to Native American communities, to communities that whose people have built this nation, and yet whose people have been the people who have been walked upon. And nonetheless, they survive. And they survive out of a kind of resilient hope that is, in some ways, for me, illogical, okay? But this is the community that I'm interested in working with. This is a community that I situate myself in. And this is a community that I very often write about. Specifically, for me, it is oppressed communities, but particularly it is Black queer women. I try to excavate their narratives, their history, to figure out, how did these women survive and how did they thrive in the midst of oppression? There are lessons, there are nuggets, there are genuine jewels that I can pull out and that I can write about and that I can give back, that I can develop this kind of oeuvre, so that a kind of oeuvre that I like to call a liberationist heirloom, something that I can give to another generation that will model, that will be keys, that will help them to understand how they too, even if that hope is agnostic, how they can not only survive, but how they can thrive. And I'm interested in doing that as a scholar. And I'm interested in doing that as a scholar, not with the tools that the academy says are most important, because I no longer, and Jared will understand this, Jared knows this, I intentionally try not to write with my eyeballs on colonialism, or trying to write in a kind of way that the academy says is worthwhile. It must be so dense that no one can understand it in order for it to be acceptable. Instead, I write in the patois, in the vernacular of the communities that are dear to me. Then finally, I kind of want to say this, and we can continue. Toni Morrison said something. It's a quote, and I have it here on my computer, and I'll read it, and then I'll share it. And Toni Morrison said this. She said, I love Toni Morrison because I was reading Toni Morrison's books when I was writing my dissertation, and her works helped me to survive a PhD study. Okay. Toni Morrison said, I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game, end quote. So if I'm free, then my job is to free somebody else. If I have some power as an academic dean, as a scholar, then my job is to empower someone else. And in those ways, this is how I share. This is how I begin to craft out a liberationist heirloom so that other persons can have hope in the midst of some really uncertain times. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Lightsey. Thank you, everyone. It looks like we're having church in here based on the chat. There's just amens, better preach. I don't know where we need like the organ or something to make this thing home. Well, I wanna ask. I mean, we're on a high note now, but I feel like there's a kind of almost a kind of ghost in the room as we're talking about the beauty and the power of our practices. And then I want to kind of come back to some of those practices. But, we all know folks that didn't make it, right? We all know folks that are struggling to even have some glimmer of a sense of kind of freedom in the midst of their life, who either succumb to violence in any number of ways, succumb to the pull of white approximation. How have you all begun how have you thought about and held space for that kind of paradox, I guess, in some ways, where you continue to do the work, you continue to have hope, but we still know folks who are dying, who are struggling to have some modicum of that in their life. What are some of your thoughts on those ghosts in the room?
The word that keeps coming to my mind is to accompany and to broker borders. So I think that there's two parts to your question that I'm hearing, which is, there are people who perhaps cannot see or experience that hope. It's been dashed too many times. It's been stolen too many times. And then there are people who are doing violence because they think that violence is an individual hope of pulling themselves up, while it does violence to others. So I think for me, one of the ways in which I struggle with the second group, particularly in the East Asian community that can also be very anti-Black, is I have to take on that responsibility, right? Like I can't just ignore that and say, well, let them go their own way. Like, it matters that I I seek people out, that I seek communities out and have those conversations. And not avoid that as a point of conflict, not avoid that as, well, we just want to kind of exist together. And one of the images that I hold in my mind that helps me understand that very deeply is Guanyin, who is a bodhisattva. So she's a bodhisattva that can go into nirvana whenever she wants, like she can go over. But one of the things that she does instead is she chooses to remain so that everybody can go into nirvana together. So sort of like crossing those borders together, not leaving people behind. One of the ways in which I commit to doing justice in the world is to remain with my community and ask those hard questions about some of the violences that they perpetuate, even as they receive and experience trauma from anti-Asian violence as well, especially today, or have those histories of violence. And one of the things that I'm perpetually saying, I think, in community is we have to see beyond, we have to see the greater systemic and structural ill that we're caught up in, including the complicities, right, that we carry as well. And being able to see that clearly is the only way to freedom together. You can't throw other people under the bus in order to just be free yourself. That doesn't work that way. So that's the one thing I know that I'm struggling with. And by struggling with, I mean I'm working at it. Not struggling to whether to do it or not, but working at it on it as a daily thing. But breaking into those spaces and making sure that that you have those hard conversations. I've been heartened this election cycle in hearing so many people in my communities of belonging saying that they're having these conversations in their churches. They're having these conversations at the dinner table. They're having them in different languages. They're bringing their, aunties and uncles to the, to the polls, helping them understand like what it means to exercise that right, not only for themselves, but for others, to think really deeply about systemic racism and structural racism and our complicity in it, anti-Blackness and our complicity in it, that people are having these conversations in new ways that are bold. And I'm glad to join in it, but there's a lot more to do. So I think that part of whatever happens the next day or the next couple of weeks, like the work isn't over. It has to continue. We can't just breathe a sigh of relief no matter what, right? Regardless, that it's still like we're still climbing and we have to bring people along.
Yeah, I was really struck. And I feel like this kind of connects to the thread that I saw both in Dr. Lightsey and Dr. Reyes, like this idea of a kind of generational perspective. And I was really struck. Is it okay if we go by first names? As long as all the viewers who know that no one should be calling us by our first names unless we give them permission, but we all friends here and that feels weird. So Patrick, I was thinking about this idea of like generational, right? And so in some ways it's like there's generations that have created space. There's also generations that have died creating those spaces, right? Or succumbed to them. And what does it mean in the ways in which we can now, I had this kind of like shift in my mind where I was thinking like, what does it look like for me to be the first step of someone else's of another generation? And then even thinking kind of theologically of kind of this idea of eschatology of like in God's life, there is no time, right? And that even for those who have passed, essentially this is kind of what Jesus in the tomb means, like even those who have passed, even those who have somehow been lost, killed, destroyed by these systems, that even they can find freedom. God even extends even into that life, right? But what does it mean for my life to somehow be a conduit into that reality, be the first step of this kind of generation that creates something in some ways? So I don't know if I have a question in there, but I feel like there was something kind of connecting there in the midst of that. What are some other things that you all heard in one another's talks or things that have come to mind we're kind of thinking about today.
Brian, I can pick up on your question or comments, questions, whatever that was. I was thinking just yesterday was hard. You know, we're remembering the dead and not remembering welcoming into our home. And you know, I showed a picture of my grandma, and I write about this in the book that's coming up, that when I lived in her house, small 1-bedroom house in Bakersfield, California, where she raised my dad and his brothers and sisters and cousins, and then a whole bunch of my generation, I was living there, and my grandma came up to me and said, "Mijo, that bed is not yours, the one I was sleeping in," because I was staying a little too long, you know, like. And part of that is I had a cousin that came and needed a place to stay and couldn't sleep there because I was, you know, in his bed, or at least that's how I've been taking it. And he passed too early from the systems that you're talking about. And I've been wrestling with that. I you know, my wife came up to me yesterday as I'm sitting in front of our friend, just crying, just nonstop. And she goes, "What's wrong?" I said, "I miss my grandma." I mean, in these moments, I miss my grandma. I'm realizing that I'm going to be that for some generation, but right now in this moment, I'm that little kid you saw in that picture earlier, that little baby. That I miss my grandma's love, because she was able to hold both truth and know that she could look lovingly at both my cousin and I, and knowing that one of us is going to be here talking with all of you on Zoom, and he's in the above and beyond too early. And so I've been sitting with the weight, the survivor's guilt of being the one that made it out, about being the one that's doing this work. And we're thinking about tomorrow. I had a couple team members suggest that I worked too much or too hard. And I really don't think they realize I'm not just working me. I'm working with bro. I mean, I'm working with my cousin. That was what we call bro. I'm working 2 lives right now. I'm working 3 lives if you count my grandma. I'm working 4 lives if you count my kids. I'm running on energy that I know my time on this planet is very short. And then it's not just hyperbole sitting between generations, that this is all I have is the love I can give in this short amount of time. I can give breath and love and into this moment of life. And I'm going to push as hard as I can until I can't anymore. So I'm sitting with your comments, because in this moment of hope, I'm carrying all that, carrying the love, but I'm also carrying all the trauma and violence and abuse our communities have experienced. And that fuels my work, but it's a heavy place. And to Dr. Lightsey, to Pamela's comments earlier, I will find myself at my ofrenda, at my altar in my house, just crying. I mean, there are moments where it's too much. And so holding those things in as both real. I don't privilege one or the other. You know, both are real. I need time to mourn. I need time to be happy and joyful, and I need time for hope. So I'm sitting in the both and all that is, and grateful that even in moments like this, that I got friends I can share, Brian, Pamela, Chris, I can share those tender moments with.
I so feel you, Patrick. There's one thing that this pandemic has done for many of us, and that is, for many, I'm not going to say everyone, but for many of us, it has made us appreciate human touch and human companionship in ways that I think we took for granted before. You know, I live by myself. I have a son who lives in Boston. My daughter lives in Atlanta. My grandson lives in Atlanta. My cousins live in Harlem, in New York. I have 2 cousins who live on the South Side here in Chicago. My girlfriend lives in Atlanta. We really haven't, I mean, I saw my cousins who live here, I mean, once. I think I've seen them once or twice in this since March, but to hug them, you know, you get where I'm coming, to put my arms around them and to embrace them and to kiss them. And my family's that kind of family. Whenever I go home to Florida, I had, you know, my uncles, they're no longer with us, but they would hold my face and they would kiss me and they would look me in the eyes and they would cry and they would say, "You back, you here," you see. And when I go home, I feel their spirit in the room. And my aunties hold me tightly, you see. And I think people think that scholars, well, one, I want to say this, that my effort is not just for myself. And I'm saying this in a very real way. You know, my money, any kind of clout that I have, any kind of power that I have, I try to take that and put good chunks of that back into the community and to my loved ones to make sure, because I feel that burden, Patrick, of being that one who gets to do this. You see what I'm saying? So I feel that, so I carry that. So I try to make sure that I check in with them every week, you know, and I have methods to take care of them. So it's not like, you know, there needs to be a class analysis of the academy also, of scholars in the academy too. We need to talk about that. We don't have time to talk about that. But somebody asked a question, and I want to address this question, and it's from Ann Walk, if I can, Brian. Ann asked this question. Her question says, for Native people in the academy, there literally are none of our people here. Practically speaking, how can we build coalitions across communities in order to create a more inclusive web of support to decrease one's proximity to isolation and wilderness? You know, and I'm talking about this isolation, but for some communities in the academy, particularly Native American communities, the academy is a kind of desert. And I hear that and I get that. I still want to say, we can't make the academy our community. The academy is a facade of a community. People are 1099 holders, W-9 holders, people with contracts, they do their thing. Now you may be able to carve out some friends here and there in the academy, but there's a lot of pretentiousness in the academy. I'm straight no chaser here, okay? And I love it's my vocation. I love what I do. But I learned a long time ago that I could not give myself over to the sense of living the life of the mind, which is what we talk about. Understanding that the life of the mind means I need to give my total self to an institution that's propped up on a kind of structure that is so connected to the tentacles of racism and classism and sexism that it could choke the very life out of me. So what do? You build coalitions outside of the academy, which is why my aunties will always tell me, never forget where you came from. That's how you remember who you are. And that's how you get the passion. That's how, Patrick, you get the passion. Christine, you and Brian get the passion to do. That's how we get the passion to do what we do. Because we stay connected to the community and we write for the community. I'm not writing a Trinitarian theology based upon what them folk back there were living, you see. I'm trying to carve out a theology for the boots on the ground, the people in the streets. That's what I'm doing.
And I think it's what's so powerful about this too is it helps us to begin to see and reimagine what brilliance is, right? What knowledge is that has to get reproduced. And all of a sudden it becomes much more complicated. I mean, and one of the things I want to flag here, I mean, especially as someone, and what I love about y'all, you come from, y'all talk about this sense of roots and generations. As a Black mixed man, those roots are harder to come by, right? So it is a kind of amorphous white community. My father was Black, but I think he was running from his own Blackness, and so didn't necessarily want to kind of pass that on, right? And so part of what I had to come into, and what was so powerful for me in the communities of FTE, in the communities of Black Seminarians Union, and is the realization of just how brilliant you have to be to hold together the reality of what is in all of its violence and seeming largeness. I'll use a technical word, largeness, and yet at the same time, we cling to one another. We create joy. We create life in these small moments. And those things are never paradoxical. And the reason why I bring this up is that growing up in a white family, in a white neighborhood, part of the bondage of that whiteness was this idea of an ideal, of a kind of perfection that was possible, right? And so always trying to beat out any imperfection for this lie of something. So anything that wasn't quite right, there was like somehow that became the totality of one's life. And I can kind of understand why in the midst of this moment of Black Lives Matter, that white folk all of a sudden get so fragile, so like caught up, because in a way their whole life is they've never been formed to have to hold together real life, death and joy, right? As though these are just simply things that are in some respect. And the reason why I'm bringing that up right now is I'm beginning to realize that once we begin to allow ourselves to both acknowledge the brilliance and the power that it takes to hold those two things together, it also allows us to look back and see new ways of being committed to creating hope. So for example, like I think my mother always struggled with the mental illness. She struggled with the arthritis in her back. She struggled every day with all of these kinds of pain, but I don't think anyone was ever there to tell her the fact that she rolled out of bed every single day and gave us a hug and loved food and laughed like there was nowhere tomorrow, that was brilliance, that was power, that was fulsomeness, right? That she could hold those things together in some way. And so I wonder, as we're kind of beginning to turn, what are some of those commitments that you all carry each day that you either have gleaned from your own, from the generations, or that you continue to incorporate into your lives each day? What are those commitments that you carry as you do your work day in and day out? As we kind of think about these things as more than ideas and the kind of hard material work of having to do this.
So when I'm thinking about answers to questions, it's always just the images that pop into my mind before the actual words. Can you tell? One of the images that popped into my mind, Brian, when you were asking that question was, I visited as a child my grandparents in Seoul during the monsoon season. And there was a big, like a typhoon that came through. And, we all the cousins, we all kind of like got underneath one blanket in the living room just to make sure that we were safe. And it was going to happen in the night. And I wasn't sure, like I was worried. I was one of the older cousins, like, what do we do? Like, do we have to leave? And my grandfather, very stoic man, he said, no, I'll protect you. I didn't know what he meant by that. I will watch. He said, I'll watch. So I remember like hearing the wind whistle through the building. And then in the middle of the night, opening my eyes because the building was shaking like this. And out of sleep, I look up and my grandfather is standing on this, it's like a kind of a covered balcony. There's like glass. He really shouldn't have been standing there, but he was standing there. And I remember watching things blow past the building, right? Like trees going like this. And I remember him standing there with his hands on his hips, just watching while his grandchildren slept behind him. It's one of the most powerful images that sticks with me of who he was. And one of the commitments that I have is to like live into that legacy, right? Of like to watch and to protect those coming behind, right? To stand sometimes in the typhoon, to stay awake. You know, like I'm reminded Dr. Lightsey like preached a whole sermon in that passage from the Bible that she talked about. And I'm reminded also of that, you know, that in Gethsemane when Christ was just saying, just stay awake with me. And nobody could do it. Nobody can do it. This idea that no, you know, for me, my commitment is I'm going to stay awake. I stay awake for, you know, my kids and the younger scholars coming up behind me that want to have, you know, whatever commitments that they bring matter it back to their communities, that want to be here to change some of these systems and structures that we struggle under. And so to watch. And it doesn't mean I'm not afraid. It doesn't mean that I don't need my community and I can just stand there by myself. But it's the legacy that I'm trying to live into. You know, this idea of standing watch so that others perhaps can rest for a while. And then when I need rest, someone else will stand watch. I trust that.
Yeah, for me, I'm committed maybe to two things. One is not to be overtaken by bitterness of the soul. I don't want to resist anger because I think anger is a good thing. And the passion of anger has helped me do some beautiful things. But I don't want to be consumed by that anger so that I make my way into an abyss of bitterness. So I'm being very careful about that. And the way that I'm doing that is once again by staying connected to the community. My commitment really is to a liberationist heirloom. I want to pass learning. I want to pass teaching, ways of survival on to the next generation. Some of that is not in written form. Some of it is just in the way that I am, you know. So in my place here, I have a room, activists whom I've known since my work in Ferguson, Baltimore, around the country. We stay connected. I've gotten to I like to say a certain age, they now call me auntie. They want to come and crash at the woman's crib, downtown Chicago. It's a place for them, you know. So I have a room just for activists too, because I know they're going through trauma. They need to come off the front lines. And so I have a room dedicated for them. And once COVID is over, I'll resume that. And I cook for them and we talk. And in the talking, I try to pass on teachings. I Zoom with my children. Sometimes I'm here in the house and I wonder, it can be something as simple as I'm frying chicken and I see that I left the handle turned outward. And I wonder, did I teach Nabi to always turn the handle inward so that he doesn't, tip the handle and the grease fall on him and burn him? Just a simple thing. So I'll immediately send them a text and say, now remember to do this. So I know they get, in COVID, I'm remembering all these kind of little cooking things and these ways of being. So I really am into trying to pass on, because life is tender and life is, I don't believe everything literally in the Bible, but I do believe in the general tenor of the Bible. And that is that life is brief. Was it not Shakespeare that also said that life is but a, just candle out, so I'm trying to pass on some stuff.
I mean, I would say two major things. One is the theme I've been picking up on is that I'm trying to pass on that love. I mean, that's what I'm committed to make sure my kids know that they're loved so that they might love others. And that is a particular type of love because it's committed. It's tied to the second thing, which is I'm committed to pushing back, resisting erasure. As a Latino, as a Chicano in who grew up in Northern California in what is the United States, colonial expansion across this land, the exploitation of land and its people has been to erase by assimilation or annihilation of my people. And my family, my kids will know that they are loved, but they will also know how to resist that erasure. To resist that sense that we can somehow blend in and be white or white American. We could. I can pass. But we're not going to do that. That's not our project. Our project is to avoid erasure because we need to honor my grandmother, her grandmother before that, because they survived some BS, just to be clear. Some violation of our people and our history, and they passed on love so that we may survive. So part of it is to actively resist this erasure that is ongoing on this land. That's what I'm committed to. And I'll just say one other thing to pick up on what Pamela's saying, that everydayness, the lessons. I think in this COVID reality, all of those things that are in the house, I'm trying to pass on as many of those as I can. Death and I are homies. We know each other by name. I don't know how many days left I have on this planet. And I'm on limited time to try to make sure my kids know both the practical and the bigger projects of love and resisting erasure. So that's kind of what I'm up to. As you talk about values and commitments, we're about that love and resisting erasure. I appreciate the question, Brian.
The thing I love in all y'all's answers is, I think we sometimes think that resistance to hegemony and the principalities and powers are these kind of grand visions, right? But I mean, in some ways, to kind of get not too theological, but this idea of sacraments, that there's something kind of powerful, that there's something, transcendent in bread and wine. I've come to also feel is true in relationships and turning, letting someone know like which way you turn the pot on the pan, letting someone know, giving someone to know that every time you come in the door, they're going to get a hug, whether they like it or not. And what does it mean to kind of live that life fearlessly? My oldest now is 22. My mother passed away when I was 25. So I'm very quickly now coming to a point, I kind of get reminded to where I'm kind of in uncharted territory. Like I'm kind of getting to this point where, like, not that I knew what I was doing, but I literally have no pattern as of 2 years. And so what does it mean to kind of cling to them and but also set them free in ways that are scary? But there's something powerful and sacramental and transcendent in all of those tiny moments and the ways that we cling to one another. But I also think the ways that we are willing to see one another for the totality of who we are, right? So what it means to be in community is not to say like, oh, my community is amazing, it's this mythic, wonderful thing. It's to know that auntie has some problems here, don't go to this person in the morning. Oh, they're going to always bring up what happened 10 years ago. But yet at the same time, we're still committed to one another. We're still creating this. We're still growing. We're still learning together. And that's transformative. That's transcendent, right? But then you start beginning to that begins to multiply in ways that all of a sudden allow us to turn to our neighbor, see the totality of our neighbor, see the totality of the people who walk into our classrooms, into our jobs, and all of a sudden we see them as people with their own stories and their own lives, right? And what happens when that community starts to kind of morph into something more than what we thought it could be? I believe there's liberation there, and I think that there's nothing that can stop it in the midst of it. Well, as we begin to turn, we were all committed, and one of the things that I love about my friends is that, you know, they said, okay, well, we're here, Brian, but we're not trying to be no talking heads, just to say stuff. No, so like y'all, if for all the introverts in the room, you're very lucky that this is a webinar and we couldn't figure out how to do breakout groups, because you all would have been in one. But we do want to make sure that you don't leave today without thinking about taking stock of your own life. You know, you've heard our stories, but our stories are our stories. You have your own stories, your own communities, your own tethers, your own traumas that you're navigating. And so the question now becomes, what are the commitments you're going to carry into the coming days? What are the communities that you're going to create? What are the communities you're going to cultivate? How are you going to enact and embody love in your life? And one of the things I love about our time together is we saw so many of those things, whether it was, you know, the tradition of grandmother's cooking, right? Or emails, or remembering those who have passed. There have been so many practices that have been named today. So for the next 5 minutes or so, we invite you in the chat box to name a commitment that you're going to make, just one. And as we've said, you know, this, the beauty of the sacramental, of the everyday, is that it doesn't matter how big or small, but what's one commitment that you're going to make this week? And we're going to give you about 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to load those up in the chat box. We're going to note them, save them, and then distribute them to all the people who signed up. So you'll be able to see what people have committed to as a moment of learning, as solidarity, as things to pray for and encourage one another in. And so while that chat box is filling up, as you're thinking and praying about the commitments that you're going to make, I want to invite our panelists to reflect on one last question, and that is, what's your hope for the day after tomorrow, for yourself or for your community? What's your hope for the day after tomorrow? Maybe we'll start with Dr. Lightsey to avoid awkward silence.
Because you think I can help you. I really do. I mean, I make no bones about it. I hope Joe Biden is elected. And I'm hoping that will begin a journey towards some civility in politics, at least from the office of the president, that we've been missing over the last 4 years. That's my hope.
So I'm going in reverse order here. I think in Wednesday, I'm incredibly conscious of already for this, as long as we've been in COVID, the emotional contagion that our children are taking on. You know, our kids are taking on the incredible weight of this moment, and they are watching us. I have never been so ill-prepared as a parent than in this moment, in this triple pandemic of COVID-19, global planetary devastation due to climate crisis, and then racial injustice in this country that goes back hundreds of years. And so I am incredibly hopeful and just pleading with everyone on this call that we pay attention to the emotional contagion that we spread to our children, because our children are watching, and they are watching. This will not be the only stressful time in our lives, regardless of the outcome. That our kids are learning how to respond in these moments. They're learning what parents, neighbors, friends, how this moment is respond. And if we can teach them another way of being together and being human, I think that will provide me a lot of hope to pay attention to what we pass on to them on Wednesday will be really, really important.
I'm going to do something really practical that I think might make a small difference, which is I'm going to feed people. I'm going to cook the food of my people and feed people in my community and share what we have, because as long as we are here, there is hope, and we will be here on Wednesday. And we can meet, I hope that Biden is elected as well. I hope that that tide can turn and we can wake up and feel progress move forward in ways that we have all hoped for. But I also know that regardless of what happens, that there's a lot of work before us still. And so I'm going to start by feeding folks, asking them how they are, making space at my table, not actually at my table, but the table of my heart. So that I remember to see people and look them in the eye, and to remember who they are in their full humanity.
I think for me, my hope for tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, is that we can recognize both how bad it can get, but from the vantage point of oh man, that was rough. Let's not do that again. And but what I mean by that is like a kind of deep existential recognition that it really does take every moment in small decisions to resist. That there is an inclination in this country, because it is on stolen, we live on stolen land, to forget that. And so I guess the commitment is, my hope for the day after tomorrow is that we all, at least for me, in a sense, kind of come to every single task with a recognition for what's at stake. Both for myself, for those whom I love, for my students. And what I mean by that, I think too, is that what I mean that what's at stake is it's not only, oh, because it's at stake, it means everyone has to like kill themselves working. But in a sense, like what's at stake is that we have to live. I think I've actually been one of the things about this COVID moment that I've been again and again surprised about is that my students don't need the grades. My students just need the space. And that they actually learn pretty well when there's not a grade at stake. I've essentially I told my students everyone's getting A if they do work. But it's amazing to see what's going on. And so in a sense, I've made things easier. So because I'm committed to them recognizing the reality of the moment, but still want to offer them something, create a kind of space for them. So I see lots of really beautiful commitments coming up in the chat box. And so we'll, hopefully those will kind of continue as we go on. And before we invite President McNeil back, I just want to thank you all. Thank you all so much for the journey that you've been on, for the ways in which you all have been hope and challenge for me, for the ways that you've reminded me that my work matters in some form or fashion. When I'm sitting in my office trying to write out a sentence and I'm like, oh, this is crap, inevitably, I'll run into one of y'all and y'all think I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And I'm like, well, if they think I'm the best thing since sliced bread, then I guess I might as well write a few more sentences. And so it keeps me going. And so I thank you all for that. And I thank you for the work that you're doing and the brilliance that you embody and all the ways that you embody it. And I can't wait to see y'all the day after tomorrow. Dr. McNeil, President McNeil, Jay Derrick.
Oh my goodness. How do I say thank you? You all have been a gift to us. Brian, Chris, Pamela, and Patrick, you've been a gift to us. This is a gift in the sense it's undeserved goodness. And I don't think I anticipated you would go this deeply into sharing who you were. And that's probably because of the Academy and the sort of shaping. But you have brought not just simply who you were in the current form, but your generations before us. And deeply thankful. That's a gift into a community that is undeserved. I mean, it really is undeserved, and it is a gift. Sometimes I am concerned that students will try to perform something they hear before they let it become who they are. And your words, your hearts, your sharing is about who you are. And I pray that we learners, whether we be students or otherwise, take this in as ways to become, not just simply things to try to do. And so deeply grateful. You spent a lot of time talking about communities and family, and hope truly is found in the communities of our belonging. And not just simply in the communities of current belonging, but generationally. The stories you told, I will not forget, Patrick, the notion of the gaze or the flavor of the hands. Or Pamela, yes, I do know about whippings and what it means to have to fight and love. And so, Brian, you started us with a story of your mother that touched us all around what it means and where we've come from. And so thank you. The next couple of days are not the end of the beginning. And our work, as you have said, will go on long before and long after. And we have to commit ourselves to the generational work, not only the immediate work. And then there is cooking. And then there is the things that we sit with the communities at hand, because we'll need each other. And so as we end, I have found myself with a prayer. I had a question at the beginning. What would make for peace was the question in my heart at the beginning. And at the end, my prayer is to say, Lord, help us to learn to belong to each other. Help us learn to belong to each other. That is the work ahead of us. That is what in some ways we're called to do. Grateful, thank you, appreciate very much. Peace to you all who had a chance to sit and listen to this conversation. It was a communal conversation. It was a conversation of friends and loved ones. And it was a gift to you. I hope you're able to receive it in the way it was offered and to share it with others. Peace to you. I don't mind this ending early. I want to say a quick thank you to Lauren and Trevor, their technical support. They made me less nervous sitting here. And I deeply appreciate that. But again, this was a gift to us. And thank you very much. Brian, any last words? I'll turn the last words really over to you, since you've been the co-creator of this.
Gosh, I just think that we are surrounded with reminders that there are always opportunities to get out of bed and love someone that day. They're all around us, and so cling to those. Roll out of bed, get up the next day, love somebody.
I'll say amen to that. And amen. Thank you. Blessings to you all as we leave this moment. There's always quick transitions. I don't like the sort of Zoom ending transitions, but I pray the words and the spirit and the ancestors linger much longer. Peace to you, and thank you.